The horse snorted, trapped, while Easter bells drifted thin across prairie wind. Jacob looked down into the steady dark eyes of Lela Nantan. Her wet hand tightened on the leather like iron, refusing mercy. Storm clouds rolled hard behind her, swallowing the pale Easter sunrise. "Please, Jacob Hale. Open the gate before riders find me." Jacob pulled the reins free and pointed her toward empty road. Thunder cracked once, and the wind turned sharp against Jacob Hale's door. Cold fingers clamped Jacob Hale's stirrup leather before his boots reached the ground. The horse stamped once, iron shoes scraping stone beside the ranch gate. Easter bells drifted faint across the prairie wind, soft and distant from the little mission church downriver. Jacob Hale looked down slowly. The woman gripping the stirrup did not release him. Rain soaked her dark hair against her shoulders, and the storm wind snapped her thin shawl like torn cloth. Lela Nantan. Jacob had seen Apache riders before. Never one standing alone in his yard. Never one holding his saddle like a drowning hand clutching driftwood. "Let go," Jacob said quietly. His voice carried no anger. Just the dry weight of a man who had spoken to very few people for many years. Lela's fingers tightened. The leather creaked under the pressure. "Please, Jacob Hale," she said. Her voice shook once in the rising wind. "Open the gate before riders find me." Thunder rolled far beyond the hills. Jacob's horse shifted again, breath steaming into the cold spring air. The ranch yard stood empty around them. Empty corrals. Empty barn doors rocking with a hollow knock against the posts. Empty porch where a second chair had gathered dust for 7 long years. Jacob slowly pulled the stirrup free. Lela's hand slipped from the leather. "You picked the wrong ranch," Jacob said. The wind shoved harder across the prairie, rattling the loose tin on the barn roof. Lela did not move. Her eyes stayed fixed on him. Not pleading. Just steady. Like someone who had already run out of places left to go. "Please," she said again. Another thunder crack split the sky. Closer now. Jacob felt the storm shifting. Felt the air drop colder. Felt something else pressing behind the wind. Hoofbeats. Faint. But coming. Jacob turned his head toward the western ridge. Dark clouds rolled low over the hills, swallowing the last pale light of Easter morning. For a moment he considered riding away. Closing the gate. Leaving the storm and the woman behind him like every other trouble he had learned to ignore. But the hoofbeats grew clearer. More than one rider. Jacob swore under his breath. He swung down from the saddle. His boots struck the mud with a heavy thud. The gate hinges groaned when he shoved them open. "Inside," he said. Lela moved fast then, stumbling once as the wind pushed against her. Jacob grabbed her arm before she hit the ground. Her sleeve was cold and soaked beneath his hand. They crossed the yard together while rain began to fall in hard slanted drops. The porch boards creaked under their weight. Jacob shoved the ranch door open. The hinges rasped like a long unused hinge fighting rust. Warm firelight spilled across the dark room. Jacob stepped aside. Lela Nantan crossed the threshold. And the door slammed shut behind them as thunder broke over the valley. The ranch door slammed shut behind them. Wind clawed at the wood for a moment. Then the latch held. Silence returned. Only the slow crackle of the fireplace moved inside the room. Jacob Hale stood near the door, rainwater dripping from his coat to the plank floor. Across the room, Lela Nantan stood motionless. Her shoulders trembled once as the heat from the fire reached her soaked clothes. Steam lifted slowly from the wet fabric. Jacob removed his hat. Water slid from the brim and tapped the floor. "You'll freeze standing there." Lela did not answer. Her eyes studied the small ranch house. One table. 2 chairs. A narrow bed near the wall. Boots lined beside the door. A rifle hanging above the mantel. Everything clean. Everything quiet. Too quiet for a house meant for more than one life. Jacob walked past her and stirred the fire. Dry cedar snapped under the iron poker. Flames jumped higher. The warmth spread through the room. Lela's hands drifted closer to the heat without her thinking. Jacob noticed. "Sit." She lowered herself slowly into the chair nearest the fire. The chair legs scraped softly across the floorboards. Jacob disappeared into the back room. A moment later he returned with a thick wool blanket. He dropped it over her shoulders. The heavy cloth settled around her like shelter. Lela closed her eyes for a brief moment. Jacob moved to the stove. Iron clanked as he lifted a pot from the hook. Water sloshed softly inside. He added coffee grounds and set the lid. The kettle began to murmur as heat built beneath it. Outside, the wind pressed hard against the cabin walls. Rain rattled against the windows like scattered gravel. Inside, the warmth grew stronger. Lela slowly lifted her hands toward the fire. Her fingers still trembled. Jacob poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. He set one beside her. Steam curled into the air. She hesitated. Then she wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat made her flinch. But she did not pull away. They drank in silence. The fire popped again. Jacob leaned against the wall beside the window. His eyes drifted toward the dark prairie outside. Nothing but rain and shifting cloud. Still. His jaw tightened. The hoofbeats he heard earlier stayed in his mind. Somewhere out there riders were moving. He could feel it the way old ranchers feel storms before the clouds arrive. Lela watched him quietly. "You heard them too," she said. Jacob did not turn. "Heard what?" "The riders." The rain thickened against the glass. Jacob set his mug down slowly. "I hear a wind," he said. Lela lowered her eyes. The blanket slipped slightly from one shoulder. Jacob noticed bruises on her wrist. Fresh ones. Thin marks like rope had pressed there. His face hardened. He pushed the thought away. He had seen too many stories like that on the frontier. None of them ended well for the man who stepped in. The kettle rattled on the stove. Jacob stood and moved to it. He poured more hot water into the mugs. The sound of boiling water filled the room for a moment. Noise against the long silence. "Eat," Jacob said. He pulled a small pan from the shelf. Salt pork hit the iron with a sharp sizzle. The smell spread through the cabin. Rich. Heavy. Warm. Lela watched the food cook like someone remembering a distant place. Jacob placed the plate in front of her. She hesitated again. Then she ate slowly. Carefully. Like someone unsure the meal truly belonged to her. The storm grew louder outside. Wind howled through the barn slats. The loose door banged once. Twice. Jacob's eyes lifted. He listened. Only wind. Still. He walked to the wall and lifted the rifle from its pegs. The wood stock rested easily in his hands. He checked the chamber without a word. Metal clicked softly. Lela froze. "I told you," she said quietly. "They will come." Jacob leaned the rifle beside the door. "They come," he said, "they'll find a rancher and a locked gate. You don't know the men chasing me." Jacob shrugged. "Don't need to." Silence settled again. But this time it felt different. Not empty. Just waiting. The fire burned brighter now. Warm orange light filled the cabin. Rain still battered the roof. Cold wind still prowled outside. Inside the small ranch house, warmth pushed the storm back inch by inch. Lela finished the last bite of food. Her shoulders finally lowered. Some of the tight fear drained from her face. Jacob sat across from her. Neither spoke. The fire snapped softly. Wood shifted in the hearth. The sound filled the quiet spaces between them. Then somewhere far beyond the rain, a faint echo drifted through the storm. Hoofbeats. Distant. But real. Jacob heard it. His head turned slightly toward the door. Lela heard it too. Her fingers tightened around the mug. The fire popped again. Warmth held the room. But outside, the darkness of the valley had begun to move. Morning crept into the valley slowly. Gray light pressed through the cabin window. The storm had passed. Cold air still lingered in the room, but the fire had burned low through the night. Jacob Hale woke to the soft scrape of iron. He opened his eyes. The stove door clanked gently as someone fed fresh wood into the fire. Flames stirred again. Warmth returned to the small house. Jacob pushed himself upright on the narrow bed. Across the room, Lela Nantan stood at the stove. She moved quietly, almost like she had always belonged in that kitchen. A small pan rested over the flame. Coffee simmered again. Jacob watched without speaking. The cabin had not held morning sounds like this in years. Fire crackling. Iron touching iron. Boots shifting across the floor. Lela noticed his gaze. "You sleep like a man who rides long miles." Jacob swung his feet to the floor. The boards creaked beneath his weight. "I used to." He stood and stretched slowly. His coat still hung beside the door where he had left it, dripping the night before. Steam rose faintly from the stove as Lela poured coffee into 2 mugs. She set one on the table. Jacob sat. The mug warmed his hands. Outside, the ranch yard looked washed clean. Rainwater still dripped from the barn roof. A loose shutter knocked softly against the wall. Knock. Pause. Knock again. The quiet felt different this morning. Less empty. Lela stepped onto the porch with a broom. Cold air rushed inside before the door closed behind her. Jacob sipped his coffee. He listened. The broom brushed across the porch boards. Dry scraping sounds. Dust pushed away. Rainwater swept toward the edge. Jacob stepped outside a moment later. The morning wind carried the smell of wet earth. Lela paused when she saw him. "You keep your place well," she said. Jacob glanced around the yard. Broken fences waited to be repaired. One corral gate leaned sideways. The barn roof sagged slightly. "It keeps me busy." Lela nodded once. She finished sweeping and leaned the broom against the wall. Then she moved toward the fence line. Jacob watched her. "Where you going?" She pointed toward the loose rails. "Storm broke them." Jacob followed her across the muddy yard. Together they lifted the fallen rail back into place. Wood scraped against the posts. Jacob hammered a nail with the back of his knife. The work took only minutes. Still, the quiet labor felt strange. 2 people working side by side. The ranch had forgotten that rhythm. A distant sound rolled faint across the hills. Jacob stopped. Lela heard it too. Both turned toward the ridge. Nothing moved there. Only wind brushing the tall grass. Jacob forced his hands back to the fence. Thunder echoes after storms. Lela did not argue. But her eyes remained on the horizon a moment longer. They walked back toward the house. Sunlight began to slip through the clouds. Golden streaks warmed the yard. Inside the cabin, the fire burned stronger now. Lela removed her wet shawl and hung it near the stove. A small leather pouch slipped from beneath the cloth. It struck the floor with a dull thud. Both looked down. Lela bent quickly and picked it up. Her hand tightened around the worn leather. Jacob noticed. "You carry that everywhere." She nodded once. "Some things must stay close." Jacob did not ask more. He stepped to the window. The prairie stretched wide and quiet. But something in his chest remained tight. Like the land itself was holding its breath. Lela began washing the breakfast dishes. Water splashed softly into the basin. Porcelain tapped against iron. Simple sounds filled the room. Jacob pulled on his coat. "I'll check the north pasture." Lela turned toward him. "You expect trouble?" Jacob shrugged. "Expecting trouble keeps a ranch standing." He stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked again beneath his boots. Outside, the wind had calmed. but tracks remained in the mud near the gate. Jacob crouched. Horse prints. Fresh. Not from his horse. 2 riders at least. Maybe more. He rose slowly. His eyes moved toward the ridge again. Nothing there. Just quiet prairie and drifting clouds. Behind him the cabin door opened. Lela stepped onto the porch. "What did you see?" Jacob wiped the mud from his hands. Storm left marks everywhere. But his voice sounded heavier now. Lela followed his gaze across the valley. The land looked peaceful. Birds circled over the grass. Sunlight touched the distant hills. Yet both of them stood still on the porch. Listening. Waiting. Because somewhere far across the prairie, a faint echo moved through the wind again. Hoofbeats. Slow. Patient. Coming closer to Jacob Hale's ranch, sunlight finally pushed through the last gray clouds. It slid across the valley like a slow breath after a long storm. Jacob Hale stood near the corral fence with a hammer in one hand. The broken rail knocked into place with a dull thud. Wood against wood. Solid again. Behind him the ranch house door creaked open. Lela Nantan stepped onto the porch carrying a bucket of water. Steam lifted faintly from the metal pail where warm water met the cool morning air. She moved across the yard slowly. The mud sucked at her boots with quiet pulls. Jacob glanced over once. Ground's still soft. "I've walked worse roads." She reached the horse trough and tipped the bucket. Water splashed into the basin with a hollow slap. The ranch horse lifted its head and drank greedily. Jacob returned to the fence. Hammer struck nail. Clink. Clink. The sound carried across the open prairie. For a long time that was the only noise. Hammer. Water. Wind brushing the tall grass. Then the barn door creaked. Lela pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell of hay drifted into the yard. Dry. Warm. Safe. Jacob listened to her footsteps moving inside the barn. Rustle of straw. The soft nicker of the horse when she brushed its neck. He had not heard those quiet sounds in years. The ranch used to hold them. Back when the house was full. Back before silence became the only companion left. Jacob set the hammer down. He wiped sweat from his brow. The sun had warmed the yard now. But the wind still carried a cold edge from the mountains. Lela emerged from the barn a moment later. A coil of rope rested over her shoulder. "You left the south gate loose," she said. Jacob looked surprised. "Did I?" She nodded toward the far field. Storm shook the latch. Jacob walked with her across the pasture. Boots brushed through wet grass. Drops of water clung to their cuffs. When they reached the gate he saw she was right. The latch hung crooked. Jacob fixed it quickly. Metal scraped. The hinge groaned before settling into place. When he turned back Lela had stopped near the fence. Her hand rested against the post. Her eyes searched the hills. "What do you see?" She did not answer at first. Only listened. The prairie was quiet again. Almost too quiet. Then far away a hawk cried. A thin sharp sound cutting the silence. Lela's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Nothing," she said. But Jacob noticed the way her hand still held the fence. Like she expected the land to move. They walked back toward the house. Sunlight warmed the porch boards now. Jacob stepped inside first. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and fresh coffee. Lela followed him. The door closed behind them with a soft thud. Jacob moved to the stove and stirred the fire. Wood shifted. Flames lifted again. Warmth pushed through the room. Lela removed her gloves. The leather pouch slipped again from beneath her shawl. It hit the floor, a dull heavy sound. Jacob looked down. The pouch had opened slightly. Something inside glinted. Old parchment. Edges worn and dark. Lela quickly knelt and gathered it. Her movements were careful. almost protective. Jacob leaned against the table. "That pouch holds more than tobacco." Lela met his eyes. "No tobacco." She tightened the drawstring and slipped it back beneath her coat. Jacob did not press further. The cabin grew quiet again. Only the fire crackled. Only the kettle hummed softly on the stove. But then a new sound drifted through the window. Distant. Faint. Hoofbeats. Jacob's head turned toward the door. Lela froze. The rhythm came again. Slow. Measured. More than one horse. Jacob walked to the window. Dust lifted along the far ridge. 3 riders. Maybe 4. Too far to see faces. But close enough to see they were riding the valley road. Lela's voice came quietly behind him. They found the trail. Jacob watched the distant figures. The riders paused on the ridge. One of them pointed toward the ranch. Jacob felt something heavy settle in his chest. The quiet days he had known here were ending. He reached for the rifle beside the door. The wood stock felt familiar in his hands. Behind him the fire popped sharply. Warmth filled the room. But outside the prairie wind carried the faint echo of hooves moving closer. Dust rose slowly along the ridge. 4 riders moved through the pale sunlight. Their horses stepped carefully down the narrow trail that led toward the valley. Jacob Hale stood on the porch. The rifle rested loose in his hands. Inside the cabin the fire crackled softly. Warm air drifted out through the open door behind him. Lela Nantan stood in the doorway. Her fingers gripped the doorframe. Neither spoke. Only the distant rhythm of hooves broke the quiet prairie. Thud. Pause. Thud again. Jacob watched the riders approach the ranch road. They did not hurry. Men who rushed were afraid. These riders carried patience instead. The first horse reached the gate. Iron hinges groaned when the rider pushed it open. The sound rolled across the yard like a slow warning. Jacob stepped off the porch. His boots struck the dirt with a dull thud. He stopped beside the corral fence. The 4 riders crossed into the yard. Their coats were clean. Their saddles polished. The man in front rode a tall gray horse. His gloves were black leather. His hat brim wide enough to shadow his eyes. Victor Langford. Jacob recognized the name before he remembered the face. Men spoke of Langford in quiet tones across the frontier. A man who bought valleys the way others bought cattle. Langford guided the gray horse closer. The animal snorted softly. Dust settled around its hooves. Langford smiled. A thin, polite smile. "Morning, Mr. Hale." Jacob said nothing. Langford glanced around the yard. His eyes studied the fences. The barn. The house. The small field beyond. "Fine piece of land you hold here," he said. One of the riders behind him shifted in the saddle. Leather creaked. A rifle butt tapped against a stirrup. Lela stood silent in the doorway. Langford's gaze drifted toward her. Recognition sparked instantly. "There you are." His voice remained calm. But the smile faded. Lela stepped half a pace back into the cabin. Jacob moved slightly to block the porch steps. Langford dismounted slowly. Boots touched the ground with a careful crunch of gravel. He brushed dust from his coat. "Mr. Hale," he said. "I believe you're harboring someone who belongs elsewhere." Jacob leaned one arm against the fence rail. "Don't recall buying anything that talks." The riders behind Langford shifted again. One chuckled under his breath. Langford ignored it. Instead he removed a folded paper from inside his coat. The parchment snapped softly in the breeze. "Official notice," he said. "Property dispute concerning this valley." Jacob did not reach for it. Langford stepped closer. His boots crushed dry gravel with every step. "I intend to purchase every acre of this land," Langford continued. "The railroad will pass through soon." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "The valley's not for sale." Langford shrugged lightly. Everything sells eventually. He turned his head slightly toward the porch. And the Apache woman. Lela stood still in the doorway. Langford's voice cooled. She stole something of mine. Jacob finally pushed away from the fence. The boards creaked behind him. What did she steal? Langford's smile returned. A map. Wind brushed across the yard. The barn door knocked once. Inside the cabin, the kettle began to rattle softly on the stove. Warm steam drifted through the open door. Langford glanced toward the sound. Then back to Jacob. Hand her over, he said. We'll be gone before supper. Jacob rested his hand on the rifle stock. The wood felt warm in his grip. Not how my gait works. The rider shifted again. One horse stomped the ground impatiently. Langford studied Jacob a long moment. Silence stretched across the yard. The prairie wind whispered through the grass. Then Langford folded the paper slowly. Very well, he said. Consider this a courtesy visit. He walked back toward his horse. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. Before mounting, he paused. His gaze moved across the ranch again. The barn. The pasture. The house. And Mr. Hale, Langford said quietly. When men like me return without courtesy. He swung into the saddle. Leather groaned. The gray horse tossed its head. We bring more riders. Langford turned the horse toward the gate. The others followed without a word. Hooves struck the yard in slow heavy rhythm. Dust rose again as they crossed the fence line. Jacob watched until they reached the ridge. Then the riders disappeared behind the tall grass. Silence returned to the valley. Only the wind remained. Behind him the cabin door creaked open wider. Lela stepped onto the porch. The warmth of the fire drifted into the yard again. Jacob lowered the rifle slowly. They'll come back, she said. Jacob stared at the empty ridge. Yeah, he said quietly. I reckon they will. The riders disappeared over the ridge. Dust slowly settled back into the quiet valley. Jacob Hale remained beside the corral fence. The rifle still rested in his hands. Across the yard the cabin door creaked. Lela Nantan stepped down from the porch. The wind moved softly through the grass. But the silence felt thinner now. Like something sharp had cut through it. Jacob lowered the rifle. They'll come back with more men. Lela nodded once. Yes. Neither moved for a long moment. Only the loose barn shutter tapped gently against the wall. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Jacob finally turned toward the house. Inside. They crossed the yard together. Boots pressed soft tracks into the damp dirt. The cabin door closed behind them with a dull thud. Warmth met them again. The fire had burned steady. Orange light flickered across the wooden walls. Lela stood beside the table. Her hands rested on the leather pouch beneath her coat. Jacob leaned the rifle near the door. The wood tapped softly against the floorboards. You said he wanted a map. Lela did not answer immediately. She listened first. The valley remained quiet. No hoofbeats. No riders. Only the fire cracking in the hearth. Then she untied the drawstring. The leather pouch opened. Inside rested a folded piece of parchment. Old. Edges worn thin from years of handling. She placed it on the table. The paper rustled softly. Jacob stepped closer. Lines crossed the parchment. Hand-drawn hills. River bends. Marked trails. One thick red line cut across the valley. Jacob studied it. Railroad route. Lela nodded. The one Victor Langford wants. Jacob's jaw tightened. Railroad men don't need guns like that. No, Lela said quietly. They need land. Jacob traced the red line with his finger. It passed directly through the valley floor. Across the grazing fields. Across the river crossing. Across Jacob's ranch. The fire popped loudly behind them. Jacob pulled his hand away from the map. "So he buys the valley," Jacob said. "Railroad follows." "Yes. And anyone who won't sell," Lela finished the thought, "loses the land another way." Silence fell again. The kind that presses heavy against the chest. Jacob folded his arms. "Still don't explain why he chases you." Lela looked down at the parchment. Her voice lowered. "My father kept this map." Jacob watched her. "He was Apache." "Yes." "He worked for the railroad." "No." Lela shook her head. "My father knew the valley long before the railroad came." She pointed to a mark on the map. A small circle drawn near the river. "Old treaty land." Jacob leaned closer. "This valley?" "Yes. My father's people protected it for many winters." Jacob frowned. "Then why Langford claiming it?" "Because the treaty disappeared." The cabin grew very quiet. Even the fire seemed to burn softer. Lela tapped the parchment gently. "This map proves the treaty land still exists." Jacob exhaled slowly. "And Langford wants it gone." "Yes." A gust of wind struck the cabin wall. The window rattled sharply. Both turned toward the sound. For a moment it almost sounded like distant hoofbeats again. But the prairie stayed empty. Jacob stepped to the door and opened it. Cold air rushed inside. The yard remained still. The ridge stood silent against the sky. No riders. Not yet. Jacob closed the door again. Inside, the warmth returned slowly. But the calm of the ranch had changed. He returned to the table. "You kept this all these years?" "Yes." "And Langford finally found out?" Lela folded the map carefully. 2 weeks ago." Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. "You bring that here?" "I ran where the valley roads led." Jacob gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Of all ranches in this valley." Lela met his eyes. "You were the only one who might not sell." Jacob looked away. The fire cracked again. Outside, the wind began to move stronger across the hills. A faint rumble echoed far away. Not thunder this time. Something heavier. Jacob stepped back to the window. The sun had begun to sink toward the west. Long shadows stretched across the grass. Then he saw it. Dust. More than before. A slow-moving cloud along the distant road. Jacob's shoulders stiffened. How many men Langford ride with usually? Lela joined him at the window. Her eyes followed the rising dust. More than 4. Jacob's hand rested slowly on the rifle beside the door. Behind them the fire burned bright. Warm. Steady. But outside, the valley had begun to fill with the distant sound of approaching hooves. Dust rolled across the far road. Not a thin trail this time. A long rising cloud stretching across the valley. Jacob Hale stood at the cabin window. The rifle rested against the wall beside him. Lela Nantan stood just behind his shoulder. They watched the horizon together. Hoofbeats carried faint across the prairie wind. Slow. Steady. More than 4 riders now. Jacob opened the door. Cold air slipped inside. The fire behind them cracked softly in protest. Jacob stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his boots. He shaded his eyes against the sinking sun. Riders moved through the dust. 8 of them. Maybe 10. Victor Langford rode in front again. His gray horse cut a pale shape through the drifting cloud. Jacob felt Lela step onto the porch behind him. The wind tugged at her shawl. "They came back sooner than I hoped," she said. Jacob nodded once. "Men like Langford don't sleep long when land is waiting." The riders reached the gate. Iron hinges groaned again when Langford pushed it open. The sound echoed louder this time. Like a door closing somewhere far away. Hooves crossed the yard. The rhythm rolled heavy through the dirt. Thud. 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 Jacob stepped down from the porch. The rifle rested easy in his hands. Langford guided the gray horse to the center of the yard. The other riders spread slowly behind him. A loose circle forming. Dust drifted around their boots. Langford smiled again. But the politeness had faded from it. "Evening, Mr. Hale." Jacob stopped beside the corral fence. "You brought friends?" Langford shrugged. "Men enjoy fresh air." One rider laughed quietly. Another rested his hand on a rifle strapped across the saddle. Lela remained on the porch. Her eyes moved carefully from one rider to the next. Counting them. Langford dismounted again. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. The yard grew quiet. Even the wind slowed. "I came to settle matters clean," Langford said. Jacob leaned slightly on the fence rail. "Funny thing about clean business." Langford waited. Jacob's voice stayed calm. "It usually doesn't arrive with 10 rifles." A rider behind Langford shifted. Leather creaked. Langford ignored him. Instead he reached into his coat. Another folded paper appeared. The parchment snapped in the breeze. "Legal authority," Langford said. "This valley belongs to the railroad company now." Jacob did not move. Langford stepped closer. "Your ranch sits directly on the survey line." Jacob's eyes hardened. "Survey never passed through here." Langford smiled. "It did yesterday." Silence fell across the yard. The barn door knocked softly against its hinge. Inside the cabin the fire popped. Warm light spilled through the open doorway. Jacob glanced once toward the porch. Lela stood still. Her hand rested quietly against the doorframe. Langford followed Jacob's gaze. "She carries the map," Langford said. His voice lost its softness. "Hand it over." Jacob's grip tightened on the rifle. "Not today." Langford sighed. "Mr. Hale." He turned slowly toward his riders. "These things can become unpleasant." A man near the back nudged his horse forward. The animal snorted. Cold air pushed across the yard again. Jacob stepped one pace away from the fence. His boots pressed firmly into the dirt. The rifle lifted slightly. Not aimed. But ready. Langford watched him carefully. "You live alone here," Langford said. Jacob's voice stayed steady. "Used to." The wind shifted. Dust rolled through the yard again. One rider reached for the reins of Jacob's horse tied near the post. The animal tossed its head nervously. Jacob spoke without turning. "Leave the horse." The rider paused. Langford raised a hand. The man backed away. But the message had been delivered. This ranch was surrounded. Lela stepped down from the porch. The boards creaked behind her. Jacob felt the movement without looking. Langford's eyes lit slightly. "Wise choice," he said. Lela stopped beside the porch steps. She did not move closer. The wind lifted her dark hair. The valley had grown very quiet. Jacob slowly turned his head. "Stay there," he told her. Langford chuckled softly. Brave words. His gaze swept across the ranch again. The barn. The pasture. The open prairie. "All this land," he said. "And only one man guarding it." The riders behind him shifted again. A rifle strap clinked against metal. Langford took another step forward. "Last chance, Mr. Hale." Jacob's jaw tightened. Behind him the cabin fire snapped sharply. Warm light glowed against the darkening sky. Jacob's voice came low. "You've already taken too many chances riding through my gate." Langford's smile vanished completely. For a moment no one moved. Then the gray horse stamped hard against the dirt. The sound echoed across the yard. And somewhere beyond the ridge, more hoofbeats answered in the distance. The gray horse stamped again. Dust jumped beneath its hooves. Victor Langford did not smile now. The riders behind him shifted in their saddles. Leather creaked. Metal tapped against rifle stocks. Jacob Hale stood beside the corral fence. The rifle rested steady in his hands. Lela Nantan stood near the porch steps. The fire behind her cracked loudly inside the cabin. Warm orange light spilled through the doorway. The valley wind carried cold across the yard. Langford took one slow step forward. "Last chance," he said. Jacob did not answer. Instead he turned his head slightly toward the ridge. The distant hoofbeats had grown louder. Not close yet, but coming. Langford noticed. His eyes narrowed. "You expecting company, Mr. Hale?" Jacob spat lightly into the dirt. "Valley roads stay busy." Langford studied him. For the first time uncertainty touched the man's face. Then he waved one hand. Two riders moved forward. Their horses snorted as they stepped closer to the porch. Lela did not retreat. She stood still. The wind tugged at her coat. Langford spoke again. "Bring the woman." One rider began to dismount. Boots scraped against the stirrup. The moment stretched tight across the yard. Jacob moved first. The rifle lifted. The barrel pointed low. But the message landed like thunder. "Don't," Jacob said. The rider froze. Langford raised one hand again. The man stopped halfway off the saddle. Silence spread across the yard. Only the barn door knocking softly in the wind. Langford's voice turned hard. "You're one man, Mr. Hale." Jacob shrugged. "Been enough before." Langford nodded slowly. Then he stepped forward again. Boots crunching gravel. The distance between them closed. 10 paces. 9. 8. Langford stopped. "You protect her," he said. "But you don't know what she carries." Jacob answered quietly. "I know enough." Langford's voice sharpened. "That map belongs to me." Lela spoke from the porch. "No." Every head turned. Her voice stayed calm. The valley wind lifted her hair. "That map proves this valley was never yours." Langford laughed once. Short. Cold. "History doesn't matter when men write new papers." He reached into his coat. Another document appeared. Langford held it up. The parchment flapped lightly in the wind. "Railroad Authority," he said. "Signed yesterday." Jacob glanced at it. Then back at Langford. "You bring paper to a rifle fight." Langford's smile returned briefly. "Men with rifles work for me." Behind him the rider shifted again. One horse pawed at the ground. Dust lifted. Jacob felt the pressure building. The valley air felt tight now. Like the moment before lightning strikes. Then the distant hoofbeats rolled again. Closer. Louder. Langford heard them this time. He turned his head toward the ridge. 3 riders appeared there. Silhouettes against the fading sun. Langford's eyes narrowed. "More of your friends." Jacob did not answer. The riders on the ridge paused. They watched the ranch yard below. Then they turned away, riding west. Langford relaxed slightly. "Seems they're not yours." Jacob gave a slow breath. "Maybe not." Langford folded the paper. His patience had ended. "Enough of this." He lifted his hand. 2 riders moved toward the porch again. Jacob raised the rifle. This time the barrel pointed higher. The click of the hammer sounded sharp in the quiet yard. Metal. Final. The riders stopped instantly. Langford's face darkened. "You fire that gun," he said quietly. "You'll bring a war you can't win." Jacob's eyes never left him. "You already rode one into my yard." The wind pushed harder across the valley. The cabin fire snapped behind Lela. Warm sparks drifted up the chimney. The ranch stood silent. Langford stepped one pace closer. "So you choose the hard road?" Jacob nodded once. Langford turned slowly to his men. The signal was clear. Rifles lifted from saddles. Leather straps snapped loose. The cold shine of steel flashed in the fading sunlight. Jacob's rifle remained steady. The valley held its breath. Then the gray horse jerked its head violently. A sharp crack split the air. Not a rifle. The corral gate had slammed shut in the wind. Every rider flinched. That moment was enough. Jacob fired. The rifle thundered across the yard. Langford's hat spun from his head. The bullet tore through the brim and buried itself in the barn wall. The gray horse reared violently. Riders shouted. Horses danced sideways. Jacob worked the lever fast. Metal clacked. The rifle spoke again. A rider's rifle flew from his hands and landed in the dust. Silence followed the second shot. Heavy. Absolute. Langford stood frozen. Hat gone. Dust clinging to his coat. Jacob lowered the rifle slowly. "You've seen what the next shot does." Langford stared at him. The yard remained still. The riders waited. Then Langford lifted one hand slowly. His men backed their horses away. Not retreating, but no longer advancing. Langford stepped back toward the gray horse. The wind blew across the valley again. Cold. Sharp. He mounted without speaking. The riders followed. Hoofs turned toward the gate. Before leaving, Langford looked once more at Jacob. His voice came low. "This isn't finished." Jacob nodded. "I know." The riders crossed the gate and rode into the fading light. Dust followed them across the valley road. Jacob stood alone in the yard. The rifle still warm in his hands. Behind him the cabin door creaked softly. Warm firelight touched his back as night settled across the ranch. Night settled slowly over the valley. The last dust from Langford's riders drifted away along the road. Jacob Hale stood alone beside the corral fence. The rifle hung loose in his hands. Cold wind moved through the pasture. The barn door tapped softly in the dark. Behind him the cabin door creaked open. Warm light spilled across the yard. Lela Nantan stepped onto the porch. The fire crackled inside. Jacob finally lowered the rifle. He leaned it against the fence post. Wood knocked softly against the rail. "They'll be back," he said. Lela nodded. "Yes." They stood a moment listening. No hoofbeats. No voices. Just the quiet prairie breathing beneath the night sky. Jacob walked toward the house. Boots thudded slowly across the dirt. Lela stepped aside as he climbed the porch. The boards creaked beneath his weight. Inside the cabin the fire burned bright. The warmth pushed away the chill clinging to his coat. Jacob shut the door. The latch clicked. Silence wrapped around them again. He sat heavily at the table. The chair legs scraped the floor. For a long moment neither spoke. The fire cracked. A kettle murmured softly over the stove. Jacob rubbed his hands slowly. Almost took his hat clean off. Lela managed a faint smile. "Yes." Jacob leaned back. "But men like Langford don't scare easy." "No." The smile faded. She untied the leather pouch again. The drawstring slid loose. The map appeared once more on the table. Firelight flickered across the parchment. Jacob studied the lines again. Rivers. Hills. The red line cutting through the valley. He tapped the circle near the river. "You said your father protected this land." Lela sat across from him. Her voice softened. "My father was Thomas Nantan." Jacob's hands stopped moving. The name hung in the air. The fire popped sharply behind them. "Thomas Nantan," Jacob repeated slowly. "You knew him." Jacob stared at the flames. Memory stirred like smoke rising from old coals. "Winter of '81, he said. Apache riders crossed the valley." Lela listened. Jacob's eyes stayed on the fire. "I was younger then." He gave a quiet breath. Dumber too. The kettle rattled softly. Jacob continued. I rode patrol with 2 other men. The words came slow. Snow came early that year. His jaw tightened. We got caught in a blizzard north of the river. Lela's fingers rested gently on the map. What happened? Jacob looked down. One of the men froze before dawn. The cabin grew still. The fire shifted in the hearth. And the other? Jacob shook his head once. Never made it down the ridge. Silence stretched between them. Then Jacob continued. I was half buried in snow when Apache riders found me. Lela leaned forward slightly. My father. Jacob nodded. He could have left me there. The memory warmed his voice. But he didn't. Jacob lifted his gaze. He built a fire. The crackle of the cabin flames answered the words. He gave me water. Jacob rubbed his palms together. And when the storm passed, he paused. He showed me the valley road. Lela listened carefully. My father told that story, she said. Jacob blinked. He did. Yes. Her voice softened. He said a rancher owed him one honest debt. Jacob looked at the map again. The red line crossed the valley like a scar. You came here because of that. Lela nodded. Yes. Outside, the wind pressed briefly against the cabin wall. The window rattled once. Both glanced toward the door. For a moment it almost sounded like distant hooves again. But the valley stayed quiet. Jacob returned his attention to the map. So this land. He tapped the circle again. Treaty land your father protected. Yes. And Langford knows it. Yes. Jacob leaned back slowly. The chair creaked beneath him. So he wants the map gone. Lela folded the parchment gently. The leather pouch waited open beside it. My father told me something before he died. Jacob watched her. He said the valley would choose who protects it. She slid the map back inside the pouch. And now Langford knows where it rests. Jacob stood slowly. The fire warmed the room behind him. But the weight of the valley pressed heavy on his shoulders. He walked to the window. The prairie stretched dark beneath the moon. For a moment it looked peaceful again. But Jacob knew better. He rested one hand against the wooden frame. My debt to your father, he said quietly. Lela looked up. Jacob's voice stayed low. Looks like it just came due. The fire snapped behind them. Warm light filled the cabin. Outside, the valley waited in silence. But somewhere beyond the hills, Victor Langford was already planning the next ride. Spring returned slowly to the valley. Morning sunlight spread across the fields like warm water. Jacob Hale stood beside the corral fence with a hammer in his hand. The new rail settled into place. Wood knocked firm against the post. Behind him the ranch yard carried new sounds. A horse snorted near the trough. A bucket scraped softly across the porch boards. Lela Nantan stepped down the porch steps with a small basket on her arm. The wind moved gently through the grass. No dust this morning. No riders on the ridge. Jacob set the hammer aside. The valley felt different now. Alive again. Lela crossed the yard. The kettle inside the cabin whistled faintly through the open window. Warm steam curled out into the spring air. Jacob watched her set the basket on the porch table. Fresh bread rested inside. The smell drifted across the yard. He had not smelled bread baking here in years. Lela noticed him watching. You're supposed to be fixing fences. Jacob wiped his hands on his coat. Fences fixed. She gave a quiet smile. The kind that settled easily into the morning. Jacob walked toward the porch. Boots pressed softly against the dust. The boards creaked beneath his weight. Inside the cabin the fire still burned low. More for comfort now than survival. The kettle rattled lightly on the stove. Jacob poured 2 cups of coffee. The mugs clinked gently against the table. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of church bells. Soft. Familiar. Easter morning again. Lela paused beside the doorway when she heard them. The bells. Jacob nodded. Mission downriver. They stood listening. The sound drifted slowly through the valley. Clear. Peaceful. For a moment the ranch felt like the center of something good again. Then a distant rumble rolled faint across the hills. Jacob turned his head. Lela noticed. Hoofbeats. Jacob stepped onto the porch. The sun glinted across the far road. Dust rose slowly along the ridge. A single rider moved through the morning light. Jacob rested his hand against the porch rail. The boards felt warm beneath his palm. The rider approached the gate. Iron hinges creaked softly as it opened. But this rider moved alone. A sheriff's star flashed briefly in the sunlight. The man rode into the yard and dismounted. Boots hit the dirt. Sheriff Daniel Brooks removed his hat. "Morning, Jacob." Jacob nodded. "Sheriff." Brooks glanced toward Lela standing in the doorway. Then back to Jacob. Word travels fast in a valley. Jacob leaned against the porch post. "Langford complaining again." Brooks chuckled quietly. "He's complaining everywhere." The sheriff pulled a folded document from his saddlebag. Paper rustled in the wind. "Railroad survey reached the capital yesterday." Jacob watched him carefully. Brooks handed the document over. The treaty land record turned up in the archives. Jacob unfolded the paper. The ink looked fresh. Official. Signed. Brooks tipped his hat toward Lela. "Seems this valley belongs exactly where it's been all along." Lela stepped down from the porch. Her eyes rested on the paper. The leather pouch still hung beneath her coat. Jacob folded the document slowly. The wind moved gently through the yard. The sheriff mounted his horse again. "Langford won't be back soon," Brooks said. "He's got other problems now." Jacob nodded once. "Safe ride." Brooks tipped his hat and rode back through the gate. Hoofbeats faded along the valley road. Silence returned. But it felt different now. Not empty. Just calm. Jacob stood beside the porch rail. Lela joined him. They watched the sheriff disappear into the hills. The church bells drifted across the prairie again. Warm. Steady. Jacob glanced toward the fields. Green grass pushed through the earth. Fences stood straight again. Smoke rose gently from the cabin chimney. He looked at Lela. "You planning to keep that map close forever?" Lela smiled faintly. "No." She stepped back inside the cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Jacob followed. She placed the leather pouch on the table. Carefully. Then she hung it on a hook beside the doorway. The map would stay here now. Not hidden. Protected. The kettle whistled softly again. Jacob poured fresh coffee. They sat at the table. Outside, the church bells rang across the valley. Clear. Joyful. The same sound that once drifted through storm and fear. Now it carried something else. A quiet promise that the valley had found its guardians. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.